Before we begin, if you enjoy gripping HOA and Karen drama stories where justice finally finds its way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more incredible stories. Now let's get started. The lake had always been a sanctuary, a mirror of calm waters bordered by forests and rolling hills. For decades, families came and went, leaving behind cabins that aged with the weather, but one house stood apart from the rest. A modest log cabin that belonged to Daniel. To him, the lake wasn't just a place to live. It was an inheritance, a legacy his grandfather had entrusted to him. A bond forged long before new neighbors arrived with glass-walled mansions and glossy pontoon boats. For most of his life, Daniel's days followed the rhythm of the water. Dawn meant fishing, evenings meant sitting on the porch as the sun dropped behind the ridge, and nights brought the low hum of crickets echoing through the trees. It was peace, pure, unbroken peace. But peace has a way of drawing envy, and envy has a way of transforming into control. The first signs were easy to dismiss. Flyers tucked into mailboxes announcing the formation of a homeowners association. Suggestions about dock colors, noise levels, and lawn maintenance. Harmless, Daniel thought at first. He was not a man for politics or committees. His life was shaped by the lake, not by meetings in air-conditioned rooms. But as the months passed, the HOA's tone hardened. What had begun as recommendations turned into demands. Daniel's fishing boat, passed down through generations, was labeled unsightly. His dock, handmade from weathered planks, was called unsafe. Even his cabin, with its rustic logs and uneven shingles, was criticized for not fitting the community aesthetic. Daniel ignored them. He had seen storms come and go, and he believed this too would pass. Yet the storm gathering around him was not one of wind and rain. It was one of pride, arrogance, and greed. The HOA wasn't content with tidying lawns or painting fences. They wanted control, complete control, over the shoreline, the docks, and the water itself. And soon, their attention turned fully to Daniel, the one man who refused to bend. One morning, he found a letter nailed to his dock post. It demanded the removal of his boat within 30 days or face fines escalating into legal action. The boat was more than wood and metal to him. It was memory, tradition, and connection. Removing it would be like tearing pages out of his family's history. Daniel sat on his porch that evening, the notice crumpled beside him, and watched the still water reflect the last streaks of sunset. He understood then that this was not just about a boat or a dock or even a cabin. It was about the soul of the lake itself. The HOA saw it as a commodity. He saw it as a living thread, binding past and present. He knew the battle was no longer avoidable. The HOA had declared war, and his silence could no longer shield him. And so, as twilight deepened and the first stars appeared above the ridges, Daniel rose with a newfound resolve. He would not surrender the lake to those who sought to control it. Somewhere, hidden in old records and deeds, lay the truth of his family's claim. And if the HOA wanted a fight, he would meet them not with anger, but with history itself. The lake was quiet that night, but Daniel could feel it. An undercurrent of change, the kind that pulls without mercy. He had stepped into a storm that would test not just his patience, but his legacy. The following morning, Daniel awoke with the weight of the HOA's notice pressing on his thoughts. The lake was as calm as ever, but the stillness felt deceptive. He knew that beneath its glassy surface, a current of conflict was gaining strength. The HOA wasn't bluffing. Their demand was only the beginning of a larger campaign. Daniel's grandfather had told him stories about the original settlement of the lake. Back then, before paved roads reached the valley, a handful of families had carved out a community among the trees. They fished, farmed, and built cabins with their own hands. Those families weren't just settlers, they were custodians of the land. And Daniel's family had been among them. That memory guided him into the town's archives. Dust clung to the air as he searched through brittle deeds, yellowed maps, and faded registries. Hours passed. Then, tucked in a leather-bound volume, he found it, the charter. a century-old document granting authority over the lake's recreational use to the eldest descendant of the original deed holders. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. His grandfather's name was etched there, and by lineage, so was his. The discovery was more than a legal advantage, it was a shield. The HOA might control bylaws and lawns, but they did not own the water. The charter made that clear. Daniel understood its power, but he also understood the danger. To wield it would be to expose himself to the HOA's full wrath. Back at the cabin, he spread the charter across his table, running his hand gently across its fragile surface. Every curve of ink seemed alive, every word a reminder that his family's stewardship was not a relic, but a living right. Meanwhile, the HOA moved quickly. Ms. Carmichael, the association president, called emergency meetings. Her voice, sharp and commanding, rallied members into action. They weren't content with fines. They spoke of liens, of lawsuits, of forcing Daniel to bend or break. Their polished homes and manicured lawns masked the aggression simmering beneath. Neighbors grew uneasy. Some whispered in support of Daniel, recalling the stories their own grandparents had told of the lake's early days. Others, fearful of the HOA's iron grip, chose silence. Division crept across the shoreline like creeping fog. Daniel, however, remained steady. He fished at dawn, repaired the boards of his dock, and tended to his garden, but his resolve had deepened. He was no longer defending a boat or a dock. He was defending history. When the HOA staged their summer gathering, Daniel knew the time had come. Their event was meant to showcase their authority. Tents on the clubhouse lawn, music on floating stages, speeches delivered through loudspeakers. But as neighbors clinked glasses and cheered, Daniel walked to his dock, hammer in hand. He posted 2 signs, hand-painted on sturdy wood. One declared fishing permits under charter authority. The other listed boating restrictions, signed simply, "By order of the original charter." The sound of his hammer carried across the water, cutting through the music. Heads turned. Conversations fell silent. By the time he stepped back, the entire gathering had seen it. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some gasped in disbelief. Others rushed to confirm the charter's existence. Ms. Carmichael's smile faltered, her composure cracking as she shouted into her microphone. But the crowd's attention had already shifted. That evening, as Daniel sat on his porch with the charter beside him, he felt the weight of generations settle into his bones. The HOA had sought to strip him of his rights, but he had unearthed something stronger. Yet he knew this victory was not an ending. It was an opening move in a much larger battle. Because the HOA had money, lawyers, and pride, they would not accept defeat quietly. The charter was a shield, but it was also a challenge, and the war for the lake's soul had only just begun. The days after Daniel posted his signs were filled with a tense silence. Neighbors avoided eye contact, whispers drifted from porch to porch, and the lake itself seemed to mirror the unease. It was no longer a place of shared peace. It had become a battlefield of wills, and the HOA had no intention of letting Daniel's defiance go unanswered. Their retaliation came swiftly. A thick envelope appeared in his mailbox, stamped with the name of a powerful city law firm. Inside were pages of accusations: trespassing, obstruction, defamation, and even environmental endangerment. The language was sharp, designed not only to intimidate but to crush. The message was clear: surrender or be destroyed through the courts. Daniel read every word with calm determination. He knew this was their weapon, money and influence wielded through endless paperwork. But he also knew he had his own weapon, one forged long before the HOA ever existed: the charter. He reached out to Jim, a lifelong friend who had grown up fishing on the same waters. Jim was now an attorney, practical and steady, with a deep respect for the past. At first, even Jim doubted the power of the old document. But after combing through county records, he confirmed what Daniel already believed: the charter had never been overturned. It was as binding now as the day it was written. When the court date arrived, Daniel walked into the courthouse with the charter tucked safely under his arm. The building's marble floors and towering ceilings felt alien, a world far removed from his cabin's weathered wood and the gentle rhythm of the lake. Yet he carried with him something the HOA's polished lawyers lacked: the weight of history. The HOA's legal team opened their case with sharp precision. They painted Daniel as a stubborn relic, unwilling to adapt to progress. They described him as disruptive, his fishing practices damaging to the community's image, his boat an eyesore. Their words dripped with arrogance, every sentence crafted to reduce him to a nuisance standing in the way of order. Daniel sat silently, his face calm, his hands folded. He let them talk, let them build their tower of words on a foundation of sand. Then Jim rose. His voice was measured, steady, free of theatrics. He began with the history of the lake, how the first families had settled its shores, how they had understood the importance of preserving it, and how they had drafted the charter to ensure that preservation. Then, with deliberate care, he placed the brittle parchment before the judge. The courtroom shifted. The yellowed paper with its ornate script carried a weight no bylaw could match. The judge leaned forward, studying it intently, asking careful questions. Jim answered each one with clarity, pointing to county records that confirmed its authenticity. The HOA's lawyers scrambled, objecting, claiming irrelevance, calling the charter outdated. But the judge was unmoved. The law was simple: unless repealed, the charter stood. And no record existed of its repeal. By the time the hearing ended, the HOA's case lay in ruins. Their accusations collapsed against the immovable wall of history. The judge dismissed the lawsuit entirely, leaving the HOA's team red-faced and sputtering. As Daniel left the courthouse, the charter secure in his hands, he felt no need to gloat. His victory was quiet but undeniable. He had not only defended himself, he had defended the soul of the lake. But he also knew what this meant. The HOA had been embarrassed in court, their power shattered before the eyes of the community. Humiliation does not fade easily. They would return, angrier and more desperate than before. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Daniel's courtroom victory should have marked the end of the conflict. The judge's decision was clear: the charter was valid, and the HOA's claims were dismissed. But for those who had built their identity on control, defeat was not acceptable. The HOA, humiliated before the community, shifted tactics. If they could not break Daniel with bylaws or lawsuits, they would try to wear him down with persistence and harassment. It began quietly. A notice appeared on his cabin door, accusing him of failing to keep his yard in compliance with community standards. Daniel didn't have a yard in the suburban sense. His land blended into the forest, dotted with wildflowers and tall grass. What the HOA called unkempt, he called natural beauty. Soon after, another citation came. This one targeted his boat again. They called it abandoned property, claiming it was hazardous and demanded its removal. Then came complaints about his dock, his trash cans, even the length of time his porch light stayed on at night. Each notice carried threats of fines, liens, or worse. Daniel ignored the papers. They had no legal standing, not against the charter. But their frequency grew relentless. Inspectors were sent to photograph his property. Cars slowed near his driveway at odd hours. On more than one morning, he found his trash bins overturned, their contents scattered across the road. These were not coincidences. They were calculated annoyances, meant to grind him down. The community began to fracture under the pressure. Some neighbors, emboldened by the HOA's aggression, turned cold toward Daniel, whispering that he was a troublemaker, a selfish man who refused to follow rules. Others, quietly disillusioned by the HOA's heavy hand, offered him sympathetic nods but dared not speak aloud. Fear of fines, lawsuits, and retaliation kept many silent. Through it all, Daniel remained steady. He rose with the sun, fished the quiet waters, and tended his small garden. Yet even he could feel the strain. The lake that had once been his sanctuary now bristled with hostility. The peace he had fought to protect seemed buried beneath layers of conflict. Then came the boldest move yet. The HOA erected new signs at the community access point by the water: private property, no trespassing. For generations, families had used that patch of shoreline to launch canoes, teach their children to swim, or simply sit by the water. Now it was fenced off, claimed as the HOA's domain. Daniel stood on his porch and watched as the signs went up. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like another petty action. But to him, it was clear. The HOA was escalating. If they could not control the lake itself, they would choke off access to it. They would try to make his victory meaningless by surrounding him with barriers. But Daniel was no longer just defending his rights. He was defending a legacy. The charter was not a relic. It was a shield, and if necessary, it would be a sword. As summer deepened, Daniel began to plan his next move. He understood that passively resisting the HOA would only invite endless harassment. To truly end the conflict, he needed to act decisively. Something so powerful, so undeniable, that the HOA could never recover. The quiet man on the shore was preparing for war. Not one of anger, but one of legacy, truth, and finality. The HOA's annual summer celebration was meant to be a display of unity and authority. Each year, residents gathered on the manicured clubhouse lawn, sipping wine beneath white tents, while music floated across the lake from a rented band. It was their showcase, their proof that order and progress had triumphed over rustic tradition. This year, however, the event would become something else entirely, a stage for reckoning. Daniel had watched from afar in previous years, uninterested in their polished festivities. But this time he prepared with purpose. He had the charter secured in a protective sleeve, the weathered paper glowing with significance under careful light. He also had 2 new signs, freshly painted and clear, one enforcing boating restrictions under charter law, and another declaring fishing rights by the authority of the original families. They weren't just signs. They were declarations. On the day of the celebration, the clubhouse buzzed with activity. Cars lined the road, music echoed across the water, and the scent of catered food drifted into the air. Miss Carmichael stood at the center, her smile wide, her voice rising over a microphone as she spoke about community pride and shared vision. Applause followed her every word, though not all claps carried conviction. Daniel waited until the speeches reached their peak, then carried his signs to the dock. With steady, deliberate movements, he raised his hammer. The first strike rang out like a gunshot across the lake. Conversations faltered. The second strike echoed louder, cutting through the music. Heads turned. By the time the last nail was driven in, silence had overtaken the shoreline. Dozens of eyes watched as Daniel stepped back, his signs standing tall against the fading light. Calm and resolute, he faced the crowd, holding the charter for all to see. Whispers rippled through the gathering. Some gasped in shock, others exchanged uneasy glances. A few neighbors hurried away to confirm the charter's existence in county records, their curiosity outweighing loyalty to the HOA. Ms. Carmichael's composure cracked. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, trembled as she shouted denials through the microphone. But her words faltered against the weight of history. The more she protested, the more she looked like a queen raging against a crown she no longer wore. The celebration unraveled. The band stopped playing, families began packing up their chairs, and conversations turned from festivity to doubt. By sunset, the grand showcase of HOA authority had collapsed into confusion and quiet panic. Daniel sat on his porch as dusk settled, watching from a distance. He didn't smile, nor did he gloat. He simply sipped his coffee, knowing the tide had shifted. The charter was no longer his secret weapon. It was now community knowledge, undeniable and irreversible. But victory brought new risks. The HOA had been publicly humiliated, their authority torn down in front of everyone they sought to control. Pride wounded that deeply does not heal quickly. Daniel knew they would retaliate harder than ever, their desperation pushing them to extremes he had yet to face. The lake lay still in the moonlight, but Daniel sensed the storm building on the horizon. He had revealed the truth, but truth alone would not end the war. The HOA's next move would be their most dangerous yet. In the aftermath of the failed summer celebration, the HOA retreated into silence, but it was the silence of strategy, not surrender. Behind the polished glass walls of Ms. Carmichael's mansion, meetings stretched long into the night. Voices rose, tempers flared, and resolutions hardened. The public embarrassment had scarred them, and they would not allow Daniel's defiance to stand unpunished. Weeks later, a new summons arrived at Daniel's cabin. This time, it wasn't a flimsy notice or a petty fine. It was a full-scale lawsuit, thicker than a phone book, packed with accusations. Fraud, forgery, harassment, endangerment. The language was designed not just to challenge him legally, but to bury him under the sheer weight of paperwork. Their intent was clear. If they could not defeat him in public opinion, they would destroy him in court. Daniel read the documents carefully, then folded them neatly. He felt no panic. He had been expecting this escalation. The HOA was fighting with pride, and pride made people reckless. Jim, his old friend and attorney, stood with him once more. Together they combed through every line, every charge, every flimsy accusation. Each was built not on fact, but on desperation. The HOA was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something might stick. What they hadn't counted on was the charter's enduring strength. When the day of the trial arrived, the courthouse was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, their faces a mix of curiosity, fear, and anticipation. Some came to support Daniel. Others came hoping to see the HOA reclaim control. The air buzzed with tension as though the outcome would decide not just the fate of one man, but the balance of the entire community. The HOA's attorneys opened with practiced confidence. They painted Daniel as a fraud, claiming the charter was a forgery crafted to undermine rightful governance. They accused him of sowing division, of creating chaos where there had once been harmony. Their words flowed like a well-rehearsed play, polished and precise. Daniel sat still, his expression calm. He had no need for dramatics. When it was Jim's turn, the room shifted. With quiet authority, he laid the charter before the judge. Certified copies from the county archives followed. Witnesses testified to its authenticity. The weight of history filled the room. The HOA's lawyers scrambled. They objected. They protested. They spun tales of irrelevance and outdated law. But each objection only revealed their desperation. The judge listened patiently, flipping through the pages of the charter, asking careful questions. Hours stretched into a long day of arguments, but in the end, the decision was clear. The charter was valid. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the lake or its waters. Their lawsuit was dismissed in its entirety. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some neighbors broke into quiet applause. Others sat in stunned silence. Ms. Carmichael's face drained of color, her authority crumbling in front of everyone she had once ruled. Daniel left the courthouse quietly, the charter secure in his hands. He did not gloat, did not celebrate. Victory, to him, was not about humiliation. It was about truth standing firm against arrogance. Yet he knew this was not the end. For people like Ms. Carmichael, pride was not so easily extinguished. The HOA had lost the law, but they still held influence in whispers, rumors, and shadows. The war for the lake was shifting once again. No longer confined to bylaws or courts, it was about to spill into the hearts and minds of the neighbors themselves. Daniel's courtroom triumph rippled across the lakeside community like a stone dropped into still water. Some saw him as a guardian of history, a man who had stood against arrogance and won. Others, fearful of the HOA's wrath or loyal to its polished order, regarded him as a dangerous troublemaker. The judge's decision had settled the law, but it had not settled the people. The HOA, stripped of legal power, retreated into subtler tactics. No more lawsuits, no more official notices. Instead, they turned to whispers. Stories began to circulate. Daniel was unstable, they said. He was obsessed, living in the past, clinging to scraps of paper no one else cared about. At barbecues, on porches, at late-night meetings in manicured living rooms, rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed he had forged the charter, that the judge had been misled by false documents. Others insisted he was dangerous, that his stubbornness threatened the safety and harmony of the entire community. With every retelling, the lies grew taller, feeding fear and suspicion. Meanwhile, harassment continued in shadows. Headlights paused at the edge of his driveway late at night. Trash cans were overturned. Anonymous complaints were filed with county offices, accusing him of polluting the water or damaging wildlife. Inspectors arrived unannounced, clipboards in hand, but always left with nothing to report. Each visit was a reminder of the invisible hand tugging at his peace. Daniel endured it with quiet resilience. He rose with the sun, cast his line into the lake, and lived as he always had. But even he could feel the isolation closing in. The lake, once alive with laughter and shared trust, had become a place divided by suspicion. Yet in the midst of that division, something unexpected began to stir. A handful of younger residents, newcomers who had grown weary of the HOA's heavy hand, began visiting Daniel. They asked about the charter, about the early families who had built the cabins, about the traditions that had defined life on the water long before bylaws and fines. Daniel welcomed them, not with fiery speeches, but with patient stories and steady guidance. Word spread quietly. For every rumor the HOA planted, there was a neighbor who now knew a little more truth. For every whisper of instability, there was someone who had sat with Daniel on his porch and heard the calm certainty in his voice. The battle for the lake was no longer in courtrooms or on docks. It was in the hearts of the people. Miss Carmichael, however, refused to relent. Her pride, wounded twice, hardened into obsession. From her living room, she rallied her loyalists, vowing that Daniel would never truly win. If the law could not silence him, then fear and division would. She believed that no man, no matter how resilient, could endure being made an outcast forever. But Daniel understood something she did not. His resolve was not rooted in pride or control. It was rooted in legacy, in the quiet strength of generations who had stood by the lake before him. He was not fighting for dominance. He was fighting for belonging. Still, he knew whispers could not be ignored. Left unchecked, they could unravel the community beyond repair. If the lake was to heal, if the people were to see past the rumors, he would need to act once more, not with defiance, but with clarity. And so Daniel began to plan again. Not a defense, not another courtroom battle, but something greater. A gathering that would force the truth into the open, where no rumor or whisper could stand against it. To be continued in Chapter 8, where Daniel calls for a decisive community meeting under the authority of the charter, confronting the HOA and reshaping the future of the lake forever. By late summer, the tension around the lake was heavy enough to feel in the air. Neighbors passed each other with guarded looks. Conversations hushed when Daniel's name surfaced. Rumors and half-truths swirled like smoke, suffocating the peace that once defined the shoreline. The HOA's legal defeat had left them toothless, but whispers gave them power still. Daniel knew the only way to end it was to drag truth back into the light. He drafted letters, each one signed beneath the seal of the Lake Charter of 1912. They were invitations, but also summons. Every household received a copy, calling for a meeting, not under the banner of the HOA, but under the authority of the original charter. The purpose was simple: to decide the future of the lake once and for all. The reaction was immediate. Some scoffed, dismissing it as another stunt from a stubborn old man. Others grew curious, drawn by the weight of history that could not be denied. Even those loyal to the HOA felt a pull, for the charter was real, its power undeniable. Whether they came to support Daniel or to oppose him, attendance was impossible to resist. On the evening of the gathering, the clubhouse filled beyond capacity. Folding chairs lined the walls, voices murmured with tension, and faces reflected uncertainty. At the front stood Miss Carmichael, rigid in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line. She had not called this meeting, but she was determined to claim it. When Daniel entered, the room fell silent. He carried the charter tucked beneath his arm, its brittle pages carefully protected. Without drama, he walked to the podium and placed it before him. The air shifted. This was no bylaw, no HOA notice. This was history, a document older than any mansion on the lake. He spoke with calm conviction, not of rules or fines, but of legacy, of the families who had built the first cabins, of their vision for shared waters, and of the responsibility passed down through generations. He reminded them that the lake was not just property, but heritage. His voice carried not force, but weight, each word grounding the room in truth. Then came the moment. Daniel unveiled a set of principles derived directly from the charter. Open access to the water for all, protection of its natural beauty, and fairness in its use. And then, with deliberate clarity, he declared that the HOA, having violated both trust and tradition, was barred from enforcing any authority over the lake. For 10 years, its members would have no say in its governance. Gasps rippled through the room. Some neighbors sat frozen, others whispered in shock. A few broke into quiet applause, their relief unhidden. Miss Carmichael leapt to her feet, her voice rising in protest, but the weight of the charter silenced her. No amount of shouting could erase what was written in ink more than a century old. The vote that followed was swift. Residents, tired of division and weary of fear, sided with Daniel's vision. The majority endorsed the charter's authority, ending the HOA's grip once and for all. When the meeting adjourned, the community was not the same as it had been when they entered. The lines of division remained, but for the first time, truth had prevailed over rumor, and legacy had triumphed over pride. Daniel left the clubhouse quietly, the night air cool against his skin. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, calm and timeless, as though it had been waiting for this moment. He knew the battle was nearly over, but one final chapter remained. For while the HOA was defeated, pride and resentment still lingered, and in the shadows of broken authority, bitterness had a way of festering. The vote had been cast, and the decision was final. The HOA, once the towering authority around the lake, was stripped of its power. Their bylaws lay in tatters, their voice silenced by the very charter they had tried to ignore. The community, weary of division, had chosen history over control, legacy over arrogance. In the days that followed, the lake began to breathe again. The pontoon boats, once paraded as status symbols, sat idle on their lifts. Children paddled canoes across the water without fear of reprimand. Families picnicked at the community shore where the HOA's no trespassing signs had once stood. The air felt lighter, as though the weight of suspicion and hostility had finally lifted. Daniel did not celebrate loudly. He was not a man of triumph, but of quiet reflection. From his porch, he watched the lake reclaim its peace. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze now greeted him with cautious respect. A few even stopped to thank him, their voices carrying gratitude not just for his persistence, but for reminding them of what truly mattered. Miss Carmichael, however, remained a shadow on the shoreline. Her grand speeches silenced, her loyalists dwindling. She withdrew into her mansion. Some nights, Daniel saw her standing at the end of her dock, staring at the water she no longer controlled. The anger that once fueled her seemed hollow now, replaced by bitterness and regret. She had tried to rule the lake, but in doing so, she had lost her place within it. Seasons passed, and with them came renewal. The forest shed its leaves, the lake froze in quiet winter, and spring returned with new life. The community adapted to a simpler rhythm, one rooted not in rules, but in respect. The charter, once forgotten, became more than parchment. It became a symbol, a reminder of balance between people and the land they shared. Daniel grew older, but he carried his role with dignity. Young families often visited his porch, their children wide-eyed as he told stories of the lake's early days. He taught them to fish, to respect the water, to see beyond the surface and into the soul of the place. In their laughter, he saw the future, a continuation of the legacy he had defended. The HOA was never rebuilt. Its memory lingered only in stories, often told with a shake of the head and a chuckle at the folly of pride. What had once been a force of fear became nothing more than a cautionary tale. One summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the water glowed gold in the fading light, Daniel sat quietly with the charter resting on the table beside him. He traced its edges with his fingers, not as a weapon now, but as a keepsake. He understood that one day it would pass to another, that the role of keeper would not end with him. And he found peace in that thought. The lake was not his possession. It never had been. It was his responsibility, his bond, his legacy. He had defended it not to claim it, but to protect it, to ensure that its waters remained free for all who came after him. As night settled, the loons called across the still surface, their voices haunting and eternal. Daniel closed his eyes, listening to the sound that had carried through his family for generations. He was not just a man with a cabin and a boat. He was the keeper of the lake, and the lake, in turn, kept him.